Welcome to the fourth lecture in Module 1, Technologies for Assessment in Virtual Education. As usual, we have two lesson outcomes for this lecture. First, we want to discuss where and how you may want to utilize emerging technologies in assessment, both for the assessment of your students as well as the assessment of your courses, programs, curriculum, and even institutions. And then second, we're going to explore the various types of assessment technologies available, things that you can use for free and for cost in order to assess both your students and your institutions. So let's build on that continued assumption that we've used through the last lectures. We now know that you need to identify where and how you may want to use technology in your fully virtual classrooms in this time to assess your students and your programs and institutions. But we're also going to assume that you already have put in place clear and measurable student learning outcomes, and that those learning outcomes are directly aligned to course, program, and curricular goals. This is important because this is going to direct your assessment activities. Data in and of itself doesn't mean anything unless it's used to actually answer clear research questions, or it's used to evaluate very clear outcomes or strategic goals that you have in place. So we're going to assume those are already in place. So let's dive in. Let's talk a little bit about student assessment to start. And let's think about what you can do beyond the traditional in-class exam. Gone are the days of the ability at a distance to have students come back together in a room and complete a traditional pencil-paper exam. So how can you assess your students, especially those that you might never meet because they're entirely virtual in their learning experience with you? Well, you have projects and presentations that you can conduct at a distance. We've talked a little bit about that in the previous lecture where we talked about collaborative and communicative technologies. Well, you can have students complete projects and presentations and even portfolios, all through online free technologies. And they can even present those in environments where they can get feedback from you and from other even experts in the field. You also have the opportunity to conduct quizzes and tests online. So just like you could in a classroom give a pop quiz of 5 questions, you can do that very easily in an online setting through a variety of different tools or even your learning management system or virtual learning environment that you're currently using. You also can assess students' discussions, social posts, and other open online writing activities, perhaps blogs or other things that you have students participate in. Often people call this participation. I would argue that these are clear deliverables that you are having students complete at a distance and are more than just participation. They're actually assignments. And even if you have them do them very frequently, then there are a lot of frequent assignments that you can use as a way to evaluate your students' success. Finally, you can also assess students' participation in synchronous activities. Just because we're virtual doesn't mean it has to be asynchronous. And I know that you all are aware of various synchronous capabilities that are available for you to utilize in order to meet with your students or groups of students in a virtual environment. Well, you can actually grade their participation. How often do they speak? Are they contributing quality? Are they being reflective? Are they able to answer questions or problems? All of that can be done and used to assess in that virtual environment. I will say that you want to make sure you don't forget rubrics, though, as you assess. And you need rubrics for each type of these activities so that students very clearly know what is expected of them and what is a good quality deliverable for any of these activities that they're completing in order for them to be assessed. I think this is particularly important for things like posts and discussions in social technologies, as well as participation, because students may know what that means to actively be engaged in personal environments such as that, but they don't know what it means to be actively engaged and productively engaged in those environments in an academic setting. So give them clear instruction. Now, a couple of examples of what we've been talking about. This is a site where a government agency has actually come together and created a project and created a collaboration space where students from all over the world, virtual students, can come in and complete those projects. What a great way to connect students with experts and to connect students with other students outside of your institution. Now you can do similar work strictly within your institution, and you can have students create e-portfolios that are reflective of a learning experience, or even that show the culmination of a learning experience in a very formal project setting. All of these can be done, and we'll talk about the technologies in a second, using various web creation and web authoring tools, which quite frankly our millennial generation already knows how to use. You can even have students complete online quizzes and use online self-assessments in order to judge their skill acquisition, or for you to assess how well are they developing the knowledge that you're hoping they will. This is an example of a developmental math module offered by NROC, where students can go in and assess their abilities in preparation for an algebra class or even a college-level pre-calculus class. And you'll see oftentimes these quizzes that are created, these resources that are freely available, will be quite interactive and engaging. We'll be talking in the last module, Module 4, about very specific resources like this that you can utilize and that are freely available on the web. Now, we mentioned synchronous technologies. We can have students participate in things like Big Blue Button, which is an open source web conferencing tool that many K-12 districts utilize, particularly utilize integrated within their learning management systems. You could use Google Hangouts and have students present in Google Hangouts to you or to other students the work that they've done or their culminating projects. You can even use Skype to have students practice language acquisition or work through their understanding or critical thinking skills as applied to a particular question or challenge that you've presented to them. Once again, all free and all easily available for you to incorporate in your lessons. Now, you can also use tools to poll and survey your students. Things like Poll Everywhere and SurveyMonkey, where you can ask students questions virtually and have them respond and see the results of other students all instantaneously. Well, this gives you rich data that you can actually act on very quickly in your classes, and that you can use to monitor growth and idea. You can even use Google Docs and Google Forms as a way for students to complete similar work or similar activities. One great lesson example that I've seen is where a teacher will have a poll at the beginning of the week and ask a couple of opinion questions, and then perhaps teach a lesson. I've seen this done in history and in English really nicely, where they'll teach a particular lesson over the week virtually, and then at the end of the week they'll poll their students again and show the students how their opinions have changed based on the learning that's occurred over that week. Now, what about cheating? We often get asked, well, okay, great, my students are at a distance, I have high stakes exams. How do I actually conduct those exams and not worry about my students cheating? Well, I think there's two approaches you can take. There's the free or cheap approach, which is creating exams that make it really, really difficult to cheat. That includes having questions that use higher order thinking skills that force students into actually having to critically analyze a problem and find a solution that would be really hard to look up in a book or to cheat an answer for. You could also limit your time. I know this sounds a little harsh for students, but I firmly believe in giving more questions if it's a high stakes exam than students could possibly answer, especially because you don't want them taking the time to look all the answers up. So give them a lot of questions in a short period of time, and it's okay if they don't finish it all, but you'll be able to identify the cheaters from the non-cheaters, particularly by using open resources, when you see how far students get in those exams. I also encourage you to vary your questions and vary your answers. You can vary the order, you can have variations of the individual questions, and then you can monitor your data, because you can tell which students are actually doing the exam while that exam is running, and which students have been given the answers and take 5 seconds to submit an exam. So use your data and use variations in order to really give yourself insight into who's cheating and who may not be cheating. Now, on the more costly side, you can even offer fully proctored exams. There are a number of great services around the world that actually will proctor your exams for you. And they'll do everything from identity verification, very similar to the experience that you all may have had if you're taking Signature Track in this Coursera course. And they'll even lock down browsers, and they'll monitor the actual student completing that exam. So I have a question for you. I'm a teacher and I'm beginning to teach a Spanish class to new students to Spanish in a virtual setting. Now I'm looking for ways to assess my students' speaking capabilities. I need to make sure that they have the oral skills necessary to be successful in Spanish. So what are some technologies that I might want to consider? Okay, now that we've thought about student assessment, let's just shift for a few brief moments to talk about course and program and institutional assessment. In this case, it's all about the data. All of these technologies we've talked about have rich data resources. Google, you can get all sorts of data on participation in document creation. You can get participation data in those forms we talked about. If you have web pages, you can get Google Analytics associated with those pages. And if you're using learning management systems or virtual learning environments, you can get participation data from those. So what do you do with it? Well, if you're looking to assess your course or your facilitation of your course, you should be looking at assessment data. How well are students completing activities? And you can look at surveys that you conduct, even clicks or participation data. I often get questioned about clicks in particular when I talk to teachers. They ask me, well, what do clicks really mean? It just means a student pushed on a page. Well, there is some very good research that's come out of the US over the last couple of years that talks about how clicks correlate to student success. Now, these are broad correlations, but they do indicate that the more clicks the student makes or the more actively involved they are frequently in your course, the more likely they are to do well in your course. Now, if we're thinking of assessment at the program or curricula level, we want to think about conceptual growth. We want to take the data from our course and facilitation activities and see how well students are learning and moving from course to course. We also want to see how well students are doing in an aggregate. Particularly if we have teachers using different kinds of virtual technologies, we want to give them an opportunity to compare those types of technologies and see which ones are more successful in our student learning outcomes assessments. I also encourage you to think about capstone experiences when you're conducting virtual programs, because that can be a way for students to bring together the concepts or aggregate their entire learning experience as opposed to feel isolated in one topic versus another. And then finally, there's always placement rates. You can take a look at how well are students moving to the next level of a course, to the next activity outside of your institution, and so forth. Finally, at the institution level, we can look at satisfaction data, retention and completion rates, and even placement rates as well. All of these will give us an indication of how well our virtual students are participating in the activities we offer as an institution as a whole, as well as how well are they progressing to where they go next. Now, I want to wrap up with a brief note on assessment. A couple of things to be thinking about when you're planning your course, program, curriculum, or institutional assessment. First, and I think any good researcher would tell you this, you probably already all know this, but it's incredibly important to create research questions first. No matter how enticing the data is and how much you just want to look at the data to get some insights, it's not actually going to give you any insights unless you know what you're asking the data for. And that is where I think it's important to be aware that traditional metrics may not apply. So let's think of MOOCs for an example. MOOCs, quite frankly, aren't always very well assessed by looking at completion data. Does it really matter if somebody completes a MOOC? Does it matter if you complete this MOOC? Really, what MOOCs have been set out to do are to create learning communities where people engage in those learning communities and where they explore topics that they're interested in. So if some of you decide not to complete this because you're not interested anymore, or because you were interested in a particular topic and not the rest of what we're going to discuss, or because you want to go run off with your learning community that you've created from this course and are no longer, need the particular course, that's fine. That's great. That means that my MOOC has met some of its objectives, which I laid out to you in the very beginning of the course, and that data isn't actually as relevant to me, that completion rates. But placement rates in that case could be very interesting to me. Where do you go next? What do you do? Or retention rates. If you are interested in the course, how well do you stay in that course? So thinking about why your metrics are valuable to the particular questions you set forth is very important. I'll also say that you should be very careful with time on task analysis. I know it's very tempting to ask, well, I want to know how long a student has spent on a particular activity. The challenge with that is, remember, our millennial generation are multitaskers. So they quite frankly might not be actually doing that activity even though the time says it's open. So just be very careful where you use that. It can be valuable, but be selective. Finally, I think it's really important to be very explicit with your students about your goals and ask them to reflect often, and you should be using that reflection to create just-in-time continuous improvement activities. The data is here for us to act quickly. No longer do we need to wait 2 years to implement new ideas that we learned from our data. Now we can do it right away, and I encourage you to do it, and do it in an action research format where you can learn as you're building this and reflect on that learning so that you're creating the best virtual learning opportunities possible. So let's end with a question. I'm back in that Spanish class, and I'm actually halfway through now. Remember, these are my beginning Spanish students. And I want to see how successful my course is this far. What would be the first thing that I should do?